Hello dear colleagues and welcome to the Didactic Laboratory. My name is Feke and this channel is for us who are interested in school-related topics, in pedagogical research and such, and where I share my experiences of working as an English teacher here in Sweden. Now, this video is building upon the previous one where we spoke about planning, and in this case we will be discussing what's known as constructive alignment, which is a way of thinking or a strategy when it comes to planning, learning outcomes and teaching activities and learning activities, also your assessment tasks. And I will break those down into those various parts and to show you some examples. Welcome everyone. In the previous video, I spoke about how learning is formed as a process over time and how we can split it into various goals that are stipulated by our courses and the syllabus. And in my case, I spoke about how I take those goals and I split them up and then I position them over the year, creating this sort of annual calendar where we have modules or units, as I call them, and where I divide them into sets of 12 lessons. And then I create this sort of academic calendar and then an annual wheel based on that calendar, which helps me to get an overview, but also to aid students in practicing and developing their skills over time and allowing me to have several assessment tasks to help them develop, to learn, and then eventually achieve their goal. Now, in this video, I want to talk a bit about more of the details when it goes into planning these individual modules or units. And here you can see two examples. Now, the one on the left, which is example number 1, is how I began teaching. So about 10 years ago or so, I would then enter the classroom, I would hold a lecture, which could be, for example, on grammar of various kinds. And then eventually my students would read in their textbook, which would have, different topics that they would engage in. They would then practice some vocabulary, grammar, or comprehension skills. Maybe I was a bit, creative, having a crossword available. And then eventually they would write an essay. And then you look on the right here, you can see example number 2, where you can see that, for example, these days, I would hold a lecture about a specific theme or a specific skill. In this case, we'll discuss in this video, will be on dystopian literature. And then I would have also a lecture on essay writing. And then eventually, as my students then would carry on, we would read a book together. In this case, we were reading a book called The Giver by Lois Lowry. And within that book, they come across these different dystopian themes, but also they practice writing. And then eventually they would then write an essay. And this sort of development came to pass thanks to, a lot of specific events in my teaching career, but specifically I worked together with a professor here at the local university, and we used the book that you can see in the image. Now, this book is the same one that we talked about in the previous video, which is Teaching for Quality Learning at University by Biggs and Tang, and this one is excellent when it came to my professional development as a teacher. It gave me the necessary tools to have a more of a bird's eye view perspective of my teaching and how I plan my lessons. And in this book, they speak about something known as constructive alignment. And constructive alignment is about making sure that the different components of your teaching and the sort of learning process that you have are aligned with each other. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means that the goals that you have given your students, the tasks that they engage in and the way that you teach them and the eventual assessment activity, that we all try to reach the same goal. And if we look back at my then teaching when I began, it was not that aligned, to be honest. It was, things that I thought were interesting at the time. They were various sort of activities, the crosswords and the reading and whatever it was at the time, but alignment wasn't that great. But when we try to become better at teaching, especially if we look at it from this sort of point of view, constructive alignment helped me enormously to become better at planning my teaching. Constructive alignment consists of these three then bubbles, or the circles that you see, which are then the intended learning outcome. It's the teaching and learning activities, and then finally the assessment task. And what this means is that you as the teacher will have a look at these three components and ask yourself, okay, so what do you want your students to be able to do? That's the intended learning outcome, what they're intended to have been able to do at the end. And then next, how you will help them to develop those skills and to have them actually engage in them. And then finally, the assessment task is then meant to help you them visualize, or for you to know that they actually learned something. Let's look at some examples of what poor alignment or strong alignment might look like. Now here we have an example of what poor alignment could look like. In this case, we have the subject of biology and the focus is the human heart. The intended learning outcome is that students will be able to create a diagram of the human heart and label its major components. The teaching and the learning activities are that I, as the teacher, could, for example, hold a 45-minute lecture on the human heart. I could show my students diagrams and we could discuss the different functions of the heart. And then eventually I could have a standardized test, for example, a multiple choice quiz with questions about the topics that I discussed. And the reason why this could be a poor example of alignment is that the intended learning outcome says that I want my students to be able to create a diagram, including the different parts of the heart, which is a hands-on sort of skill. However, when I teach them, I simply lecture, which makes them quite passive, and then eventually there's a simple test at the end. And absolutely, the students might pass the test, they might have learned the sort of different topics related to the heart, but it doesn't really align back to the initial intended learning outcome that says that the students are meant to create a diagram. So that's a reason why this is okay teaching, absolutely. I mean, I've done this several times in the past, but let's look at a good example of what stronger alignment might look like. Here we also have the same sort of topic where we have biology, and the students are meant then at the end to be able to create a detailed labeled diagram of the human heart and explain the functions of each part. So this is the intended learning outcome. The teaching and the learning activities are that I, for example, could still hold a lecture on the human heart. The students could study the anatomy of the heart in using textbook or different kinds of online resources that they come across, and then also to practice creating diagrams where they explain the different parts to one another as a form of peer learning. And then eventually the assessment task would be a presentation where they show this sort of labeled diagram, and then I as the teacher would be able to evaluate the accuracy of the diagram based on the explanations that the students have given me. And this is stronger because it directly supports the learning outcome. So the students are meant to be able to explain and create a diagram, and then I specifically look for those things in the assessment task. So it's quite simple when you look at it like that, but it does require a sort of shift in perspective when it comes to teaching, always making sure that there are no lessons that are fluff lessons that we just add there for space or for something to do. And I know this can be difficult at times. I have colleagues who find it a little bit tricky since they feel that it's quite mechanical. But the thing is that there are many, many benefits to working with constructive alignment. It helps you to always make sure that whatever you do supports the students in their learning. And I can see three main benefits of using constructive alignment. And the first one is that it improves learning. It makes sure that all of my lessons are effective, they help students to reach their goals, and the students get a better understanding of the outcome. They know where they're heading. Secondly, the expectations are clearer. The students know what they need to know in order to succeed. There are no guesses what will be coming up on the tests or what they're meant to show at the end. And also that I'm certain that my activities and that my assessment, that they actually connect together, and it most likely then will help students to succeed and to reach that goal. So it supports them in the long run. Now, let me show you how I've worked with alignment. And we go back to the previous lessons where I spoke about those 12 lessons modules that I showed previously. And I do it in two ways, depending on what the class wants, because I give them the option to decide here. And the first one is what I call separate assessment activities. And here you can see we have the 12 lessons, and step by step, each of these are meant to support the students to reach the goal, to be able to pass the test and to improve their learning as we reach the goal. Now, lesson number 1, for example, I present one of the goals we engage with. It could be, for example, reading, understanding themes in literature. It could be grammar or whatever. Lesson 2, we practice those skills. And then we have a quiz. And you can see that all of those relate back to what happened the previous lessons. We repeat the same thing during lesson 4, 5, and 6. So I have a lecture, we practice, and then eventually we quiz it. And then, based on what appears on the quiz on lesson 3 and 6, those are the same ideas that appear on a test, lesson number 7. So I make sure that my students have prepared several times to pass a test. After that, I give them feedback, and then eventually they have a second test based on the goals. So for example, if they write an essay or if they hold a speech, I want to look for those specific things that I've taught them previously. The other way that I do this is what I call the combined assessment activity. In this case, we can see they have the same sort of idea, but we added one. So the quiz is on lesson number 4 and 8 in this case, and we added yet another lesson to practice and apply our skills, lesson number 3 and 7. What we do instead is that lesson 11 and 12 combines different skills. So previously we might have had a reading comprehension skill, or we might have had a listening comprehension skill, lesson 7. In this case, we combine them during the final 2 lessons, so the students could, for example, listen to a speech or listen to something, try to describe it or use it in their own writing or speaking as a means of combining 2 skills at the same time. Practically, it could look like something like this. This is a module that I taught the previous year for one of my English classes where we were focusing on dystopian fiction. In this case, the first lesson, I lectured on dystopian themes and common topics in dystopian literature, and then also why the book The Giver by Lois Lowry was decided to be banned in certain parts of the world. So that was lesson number 1 mainly, and we engaged in the book and we talked about some of the major themes. And then lesson number 2, we practiced some of the vocabulary that the students would come in contact with when reading the book, and then we read parts of it together to be able to discuss those themes and those vocabulary. Lesson number 3, we discussed the themes once again as they came even further into the book, and then we wrote about it as well. Then lesson number 4, I lectured about how to write an essay properly from an argumentative perspective, and then also we kept on reading. And you can see here that lesson number 1, 2, and 3 was focusing on identifying some of the common themes and combining them with the examples from the book. So mainly they're focusing on understanding and doing that by identifying the themes. Then as we carry on with vocabulary practice, with reading and writing and so on, we focused on the writing skills, which I lectured about during lesson number 4. So in this case, it was about applying the writing skills that they've learned, that I taught them, and using them to analyze these themes. Eventually, lesson number 7 was a digital reading comprehension test, where I specifically wanted to see if the students were able to identify those sort of key elements and themes using a part of the book. And then eventually I spoke with my students about their progress. We summarized the story thus far, we read together, and then finally we read the ending and discussed the ending during lesson number 10. And then finally, the students wrote an essay, so digitally in this case, over the course of 2 lessons, where they then talked about the themes. They could choose a few themes from the book The Giver, and they also could discuss whether or not they believe that it's correct to ban the book, if they believe that it was correct or not. And this mainly tested the ability to express themselves in writing. and to do that by analyzing, taking parts of the story and the themes and breaking them down into smaller parts to support their ideas. So here you can see a way that I practically tried to use constructive alignment over a period of lessons, making sure that I have assessment tasks spread out, but also that my teaching activities and my learning activities all align to the final goals. So to summarize, in this video, we talked about how I built upon the previous video where I spoke about this sort of modular way of teaching that I use. And here we talked about the strategy known as constructive alignment, which helps to make sure that my goals with the teaching that I have and the activities we do and the assessment, that they all stay together and reach the same goal. Finally, I showed you some examples of how I do this from different sort of perspectives with my own classes as an example. So thank you everyone for watching this video. I truly appreciate it. If you find that this video has been informative, you can give me a message by giving it a thumbs up or leaving a friendly comment in the comment section below. If you have colleagues that you believe might find this interesting, please feel free to share the video with them. And if you want to be able to see more things that I do and to support the channel, please consider subscribing, since it really helps me to reach out and hopefully appease the algorithm. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to send me a message either here on YouTube, or you can always find me on Instagram, on Facebook, and so on. So thank you once again for watching, and see you next time.